I'm a PhD student in Indigenous Sustainability at Arizona State University and moderator for this evening's event. So again, thank you. And I want to welcome everyone to the second installment of the Latine Global Solidarities Series, each of which are a three-part series that delves us into current events that inspire social justice movements. Our first series was focused on student-led initiatives across the country. In the second part of this series, we will explore past and current liberation movements and the important role of community organizers in today's society. We will also highlight opportunities for greater collaboration with diverse communities and their epistemological traditions by addressing the impacts of unjust systems and structures. So we have a lot ahead of us this evening. This is the first event of our second series, where we'll be focusing on providing a framework of theology for the rest of this series and provide an opportunity to relate it to current events and the influence in community organizing. Before we begin, I wanted to do a very, very brief grounding exercise so that we can start this event, as many of my Indigenous kin of Turtle Island say, in a good way. So if everyone would enter a mental and/or physical posture that helps you enter a state of reflection, please join me in the following intention. Let's take a deep breath in and out. Now, imagine yourself somewhere where you feel the most free. It could be your living room, in your abuelita's embrace, en la playa. Take a moment to do that. A place where you feel the most free. Now, imagine certain people that I'm about to name in the same position as you, standing, sitting, crouching, or kneeling. I want you to think about who inspires you as you labor towards justice. Who is that person? Who inspires you as you move through healing? Who is that person? Who inspires you in your own liberation? Who is that for you? And lastly, who inspires you in our collective liberation? Who do you see? Imagine these people and hold them with you in this space as we have our conversation here tonight. Now, take a moment to breathe in deeply and hold it. Return to this moment with me. And breathe out. Now, let's return with intentional focus. Thank you for joining me in that exercise. I hope everyone feels refreshed and ready for this conversation. Now, without further ado, I would like to invite Dr. Jorge Rodriguez to discuss the relationship between the Hispanic Scholars Program and the HSP Alumni Network, and to give us an introduction into the wonderful work that we are doing here.
Welcome, everyone. I'm so glad that you're here. As Taina mentioned, my name is Dr. Jorge Rodriguez. I have the pleasure of serving this organization as the Associate Director for Strategic Programming alongside an incredible staff and incredible alumni network that supports and expands our work. For those who are new to the HSP is a nonprofit that since 1989 has been empowering folks committed to the Latina community with tools to serve that community, especially those who are connected to religious and theological education. We do so by building bridges between Latina and non-Latina peoples, by empowering Latina communities, especially women and other minoritized folks within the community. And we do this through a broad range of programming and education with credit granting programs and public scholarship. We have a four-part book series coming out on Latinidad and theological education through Fortress Press. We do mentorship programs. We do professional development programs, including programming and fundraising for those who are interested in learning more. And part of the work we do is coming alongside our incredible alumni. We've had over 2,000 alumni who have graduated from HSP programming in the last 36 years, many of whom are on this call, all of whom are on this call, actually, the speakers tonight. Alumni who have gone on to do community organizing work, ministerial work, who have gone on to be faculty. And part of what the HSP Alumni Network sets out to do, as founded in 2021, is to create spaces for alumni to build deeper connections, to gain further professional development opportunities, and to expand their understanding of their own vocation, even in the space that they occupy now, not as students. And so I'm thrilled to come alongside the HSP Alumni Network today as we host this incredibly important and timely conversation about the history and reality of liberation theology. If you've had about 20 seconds to look outside, to look at the news, you see that we're in a moment where the oppressed, the marginalized, the systems of colonialism, coloniality that have subjugated our peoples for 500 years continue manifesting in new ways. And part of the work we do as an educational institution is provide frameworks and histories and understandings to know that the realities we are facing today are not new, even though they might look slightly different. And that our people, we come from a lineage of people who have resisted, who have found ways to negotiate empire, to undermine empire, to resist empire in a way that makes us all just a little bit more free. And so the goal of this series and coming alongside our alumni is to continue that educational mission and empower two members of our alumni base, Dr. Bobby Rivera and Dr. Francisco Garcia, to help the community have deeper understanding, history, knowledge about how we got here, where we're going, and what steps we might take to cultivate a world that's a little bit more free. So I'm grateful for you being here today on behalf of the HSP, and I will turn it back to Taina to introduce our guests.
Thank you, Dr. Rodriguez. Thank you so much for that and that helpful context and short narrative on the story of how we got to be where we are as HSP. And yeah, so thank you so much for that. I would like to first take a minute to outline the structure of this evening so folks have a vision of where we're headed. So we'll first have a keynote presentation by Dr. Bobby Rivera, and then our respondent, Dr. Francisco Garcia, will have an opportunity to respond to the keynote and answer questions, hopefully followed by audience Q&A. Now, please join me in welcoming our keynote speaker. Dr. Bobby Rivera is Associate Professor of Theology at St. John's University in New York, earned his PhD in Systematic Theology from Boston College. His research and teaching interests focus on Latina OX and Latin American theologies, theology and social theories, and contemporary Christologies. He is the author of the forthcoming book, Christ for the Excluded, Christology, Globalization, and Liberation, for the T&T Clark series and Edward Shilovic series. He is currently working on a project tentatively titled Theologia en la Brega, Theological Reflections on Debt, Disaster, and Diaspora. With Michelle Saraceno, he co-edited the book Enfleshing Theology, Embodiment, Discipleship, and Politics in the work of M. Sean Copeland. And as a Nuyorican, Dr. Rivera and his partner have 3 sons, and they enjoy road trips, sports, movies, and ice cream. Thank you so much for joining us and sharing your vital perspectives with us tonight. Everyone, Dr. Rivera.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Taina. And good evening. It's great to be with you. I'm honored to have been invited to frame our conversation for this second Latinx Global Solidarity Series, and to do so with my colleague, Dr. Francisco Garcia. My thanks to the Hispanic Scholars Program, the HSP Alumni Network, aka HAN, and especially to Daniela, Larry, Taina, and Linnell for putting this event together and inviting me to be part of it. As Dr. Rodriguez mentioned, I am a proud alum of the HSP program, summer of 2006, TCU, froggy tacos and beers in effect. And it was a very transformative experience for me. And I'm deeply honored and humbled to be able to be back at HSP and with the alumni and be able to pay forward in significant ways what's been given to me. I've been asked to briefly address the importance and impact of theologies of liberation as they emerged, the then, and to share some aspects of their current relevance in today's context, the now. I do want to note that given the limited time in which I'm sharing my remarks, I'll be painting in broad strokes, leaving a number of details to be etched in, and I won't be able to nuance every detail, though we can certainly address some specifics in our Q&A. I think one way to understand the emergence of theologies of liberation is that they were ways of rereading the Christian tradition from the perspective of the economically, racially, sexually, and culturally oppressed, with the hope that the oppressed would be liberated from their oppressions and empowered to concretely and materially experience life as free and flourishing beings in this world. Now, let me address a few things that I think follow from this. First, I think we should understand that these are theologies. That is to say, these are ways of speaking about God, of speaking about the divine, insofar as they are concerned with raising questions about who God is, where God is, how God relates to us. And they're also concerned with raising questions about who we are, how we relate to one another, and how we relate to God. Secondly, I'd like to point out that the specific theologies in question were and are rooted in the Christian tradition, right? And I want to emphasize that I'm focusing my remarks on those theologies of liberation that emerge out of the Christian tradition, while also recognizing that there are other religious traditions who themselves have ways of thinking about liberation and what that means in conversation with their respective traditions. So the theologies that I'm thinking about are those that are rooted in the Christian tradition, broadly understood as a tradition shaped by a story or stories, symbols, and structures. Right? And briefly, what I mean by the story or stories is that Christianity is a tradition that focuses on a story or stories about a Jewish man called Jesus who lived in Palestine under Roman imperial occupation, whom out of a sense of a divine call said some things and did some things that challenged the social political order of his day, and he died as a result. Now, according to the Christian tradition, the story doesn't end there. He rose from the dead, appeared to some, gave a charge, and returned to where he came from. But when we think of the Christian tradition and the theologies of liberation that emerge out of this tradition, this is one of the references that I think is helpful to keep in mind. And what I mean by symbols is simply those physical representations that point us back to the story of Jesus, that remind us of important aspects of the story of Jesus. And then finally, by structures, I'm referring in some ways to the ways in which people organize around the stories and around the symbols in order to remember the stories and to retell them. So again, these are theologies that are emerging out of this tradition, broadly speaking, a tradition shaped by stories, symbols, and structures. Thirdly, I'd like to suggest that these theologies of liberation, that is, are theologies that foregrounded the contextual and concrete realities of the oppressed as their starting points for the rereading of the Christian tradition. So, in some ways, what marks theologies of liberation theology as new is the fact that they are foregrounding where they are rereading this tradition from. Now, in some ways, we could say, but all theology is contextual theology, right? But in the case of theologies of liberation, by foregrounding their context and the concrete realities of the oppressed, they're challenging in some ways a presumption to the universality of theology, right? And so context is important when this rereading of the Christian tradition is taking place. That is the starting point. Finally, I would like to suggest that this rereading was undertaken not only from the perspective of the oppressed, but with tools that would help us understand why the oppressed are oppressed and enable us to challenge and transform the conditions that created the possibility for oppression, and also think about the conditions that can create the possibility for life and for liberation. So in some ways, this is the novelty of liberation theology. That is to say, its method is to engage those tools of analysis that help us understand the complex realities of the world that we live in. If we are in the world, and if we affirm that God encounters us in this world, then we need to understand the kind of world that we live in. And so what liberation theologies help us to do is to engage those ways of knowing that help elucidate the realities of the world in which we encounter God and one another. And so this also poses a challenge to traditional ways of doing theology, ways that privileged another kind of discourse in order to enable the theological task to be undertaken. In the case of the traditional westernized approaches to theology, it has been thought that philosophy, right, is the handmaiden to theology. And what liberation theologies provide is a challenge to this by saying we also need to engage the social sciences as a way of thinking about who God is, where God is, who we are, how we are, if we're going to adequately understand the realities of the world that we are in. It isn't to say that there's a dismissal, for example, of philosophy outright, but the question could be raised, whose philosophy are we privileging? And it also isn't to suggest that we engage the social sciences uncritically, because we'd also need to raise the question, whose social sciences are we engaging? What I want to suggest, however, is that in terms of a method, right, of a doing of theology, what was new in liberation theology was not so much for grounding the context, although that was important, and it did, but the method by which it engaged the theological task, that is to say, an engagement with the social sciences. Now, I'd like to focus on two contexts, though there were and are others, in which this rereading that I mentioned took place. And I like to think of these rereadings taking place in multiple contexts simultaneously and serendipitously. In the context of Latin America, the rereading of the Christian tradition took place against the broad backdrop of a history shaped by colonialism, a civilizing mission, and a Christianity all too willing to sanction and benefit from its relationship to political power. More specifically, in the 20th century as the Cold War is taking place and its impact is being felt to a significant extent in Latin America. As multinational corporations are extracting resources from Latin America and destabilizing political structures, there was rising concern about the economic impact experienced on the continent, especially as it was felt by those populations excluded from the concrete material resources necessary for them to live and to flourish. It was in this setting that a Peruvian priest by the name of Gustavo Gutierrez and Latin American bishops reread the gospel from the perspective of the poor. Now, I'm here limiting my remarks to those theologies that emerged in the context of the Catholic Christian tradition in Latin America. These rereadings were influenced by what transpired at the Second Vatican Council and taking seriously the need to read the signs of the times. So Vatican II convenes in the 1960s on the heels and in the aftermath of two world wars. So in some ways, the Catholic Church is left reeling with what they just witnessed and their irrelevance in some ways and their silence around some of these issues. And so one of the things that emerges from the Second Vatican Council is this understanding that the church exists in the world. And if the church exists in the world, we need to understand the world in which the church exists. Hence, we need to read the signs of the times. And so in some ways, what Latin American bishops do is when they convene in the aftermath of the Second Vatican Council, they raise that question, what are the signs of the times? But they ask specifically, what are the signs of the times in Latin America? That is to say, what is happening in our current context that we need to pay attention to and respond to theologically? One overwhelming response was the reality of the poor, the material poor. For Gutierrez, material poverty was a scandalous condition which, quote, leads to death, unjust death, early death, death due to illness, hunger repression, physical death, and cultural death. In light of this reality, how do you tell the poor God is love? In Gutierrez's rereading of the gospel, God is encountered in the poor as a God who loves the poor, sides with the poor, and is actively at work in history for the liberation of the poor. In the context of the United States, the rereading of the Christian tradition also takes place against the backdrop of a history marked by colonialism, settler colonialism, displacement and dispossession, enslavement and exclusion. If read from a particular perspective, and it seems to me it's a dominant perspective that we hear today, it's the history of a people who understood and reimagined themselves as God's chosen people, this land as their promised land, and what becomes the United States as a nation blessed and ordained to be a light to the world, espousing ideals of freedom, equality, and democracy. In the 20th century, having witnessed and continuing to experience the contradiction to those ideals of freedom, equality, and democracy, there was a continuing struggle to define who belongs. Who is or isn't a United States citizen? What does it mean to be the United States? What is Christianity? More specifically, in the aftermath and now the afterlife of enslavement, Jim and Jane Crow laws, the struggle for civil rights, and social movements for Black power, there emerged a rereading of the Christian tradition from the perspective of a people whose very humanity had been denied and denigrated on the artificial basis of a racial construction that presumed whiteness to be the universal norm for humanity. In this rereading, James Cone, Protestant theologian, he makes the affirmation that God is the God of the oppressed, and that in this God's identification with Black people suffering and dehumanization, God is a God who is claimed to be Black. In fact, the incarnation of Jesus could be understood as God's affirmative action of Black humanity. Hence, Jesus is Black. This was the radical rereading that James Cone offered within the context of the Protestant Christian tradition, with important implications for Christianity. It seems to me that Cone is issuing a challenge, right? By naming his theology Black, by affirming that God is Black, he's saying that he's understanding the reality of who God is and where God is and how God is from a perspective shaped by Blackness. He's foregrounding his reality. And it seems to me he's challenging others to do the same, his white counterparts. I'll move on quickly. Now, in their rereading of the Christian tradition, however, there were significant omissions. Right? If God loves the poor, who then are the poor that we're talking about? If the Black experience, for example, is a source for theology, whose experience are we talking about? Further, questions emerged around the human centricity of these theologies of liberation. Today, the realities of the poor are understood as the realities of the sexual poor, the sexualized poor, the non-human poor. Theologians like Marcela Altos Reed have posed significant challenges to theologies of liberation today to recover in some ways an emphasis on materiality, especially embodied materiality, and the oppressions that those who do not conform either to sanitized theologies or sanitized sexualities experience. Dolores Williams helped us to understand that the Black experience is incomplete if we do not take into account the wilderness experience, the experience of surrogacy within the context of a reproductive economy. It seems to me that if we take seriously a commitment to reread the Christian tradition from the perspective of the oppressed, that the question of liberation has continuing relevance. As I say this, I also want to share that there's a need to constantly analyze in a critical way the following. What do we mean by liberation? Liberation for whom? Liberation from what? These are questions that we must continually wrestle with. I think two contemporary issues that theologians have been wrestling with, and which will be the subject of the following conversations, have to do with environmental and migration realities. The question to raise is, who is God? Where is God? How is God in our ecological realities? Who is God? Where is God? How is God in the realities of migration? Can a rereading of the Christian tradition from the perspective of an earth in crisis, from the perspective of peoples who are constantly on the move for a host of socio-political and economic reasons, prove liberating and life-giving today? These, I think, are some questions that we need to continue to wrestle with and to ask. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Rivera, for providing us with these insights into what is happening in our world and the importance of the question of liberation. The question of liberation has continuing relevance indeed. I loved that point in particular. I want to take this time to introduce our respondent now, Dr. Francisco Garcia, into a time of response and reflection. to share experiences, reflections, and expertise related to this conversation with our keynote speaker. So the Reverend Dr. Francisco García is an Episcopal priest, organizer, and theological educator. He completed his doctorate in theology, ethics, and action at Vanderbilt University. He works as a campaign director with Bargaining for the Common Good at the Action Center on Race and the Economy, and teaches at the Church Divinity School of the Pacific. He's a co-founder and co-chair of Sacred Resistance, the Sanctuary Task Force, and Immigrant Rights, Solidarity, and Accompaniment Ministry in the Episcopal Diocese of Los Angeles. Francisco's work centers around collaborative community, labor, congregational, and interfaith organizing that integrates racial, economic, and environmental eco-justice efforts. He'll soon be working on his first book, stemming from his doctoral research, which involves the development of social movement-oriented ecclesiologies outside of formal church structures through an exploration of faith practices among Latina immigrant workers organizing in their workplaces and communities. Thank you so much for being here and contributing your thoughts to this important discussion. So let's start with some brief reflections on the keynote, and then we'll jump into a collective conversation. Dr. Garcia, any immediate responses to what we just heard?
Yes, thank you so much, Taina. And thank you, Dr. Rivera, for that wonderful level setting, for providing just an amazing, in such a short amount of time, right? It's such a challenge to try and articulate the historical grounding and significance of liberation theologies, not just in Latin America, but also in the United States. And to connect it to some contemporary realities and issues. So thank you so much for doing that. And there's so much to consider, given what Dr. Rivera has laid out, and these issues of migration and ecological, environmental justice issues that will be discussed in future conversations. But let me begin by just sort of taking a step back in terms of the current, political, social, economic, religious, moment. And for that, I have to draw on some inspiration from Dorothy Sörla, a German feminist liberation theologian, who spoke of, prophetically, I think, of the issue of Christo-fascism, over 30 years ago. I think we are in a current moment, especially in the context of the United States, where we are dealing with these multiple forces of white Christian nationalism, and alongside a racialized capitalism that has been developing strength and power over and against many of our communities for generations. And so this moment of rising authoritarianism, what we're seeing on our streets, liberation theology, I believe what it does best, when it is at its best, is speaking to the real context on the ground. And that's something that Marcella Althus Reed critiqued, early, traditions, the early waves of liberation theology, in that the concrete reality of the poor, avoiding an abstraction of who the poor are, as Dr. Rivera said, and really getting into the specifics and to look at who was excluded from those initial categories, or who was assumed to be the normative poor, right? Which tended to be, the male, working figure, whether a poor farmer or an urban, worker, but not really sort of concretizing the poor in its largest reality across geographies, across race, ethnicity, class, gender, sexuality, all of those issues. In our current moment, we're dealing with this particular brand at the highest levels of the administration of this Christo-fascism that then has a direct impact on the reality of, working class, Latine, immigrant, Black and brown communities, which cuts across gender, sexuality, and all of these matters. And, to bring it, to a very direct, and real context, just this morning, I'm on a number of, rapid response chats on Signal, as many of you probably are, if you're doing any kind of work right now around what's happening with immigration. And there was, a raid this morning at a Home Depot in the San Gabriel Valley, and 5 day laborers, jornaleros, were taken, kidnapped, stripped away from their families in a moment's notice. And this is an atrocity. This is an abomination, to come back to the theology, right? This is an abomination if we look to God as the source of love, light, liberation, ultimate belonging, supreme communion, all of these things. This is an abomination before God and any semblance of what God might be, and definitely contrary to the gospel that Jesus, taught and witnessed to and died, because of this belief in a loving and liberating God. And so it was just, up front and center to see, as I got there, the raid had already happened, and I was hearing firsthand accounts from the initial first responders. I was showing up to provide a pastoral response to see what I could do, and just to show that people of faith are in this work, on the ground, to stand with those who are most impacted by the current policies. And it was just, found out about a particular jornalero de labor who was taken, and all I could see was his truck. Just to see that his truck was present, and but he's gone, right? And the kinds of details that volunteers have to do to sort of track down families and to ensure that, this jornalero gets his medicine, and to try to go through the maze of immigrant detention, where he's at risk of immediate deportation, all of these things. We need to ground our liberation theologies in these kinds of realities. This is the context and time that we are in. Decades ago, another liberation theologian, Jose Miguel Bonino, spoke of doing theology in a revolutionary situation. At that time, he was speaking about the immediate aftermath of dictatorships, of the overthrowing of Allende in Chile, and the military regime that took power, and so many other dictatorial regimes that had been taking place in Latin America in response to revolutionary progressive movements of which people of faith were engaged in. I believe that we are in a current moment where we are needing to reread and to redo liberation theology, in a Christo-fascist context, in a revolutionary context. What does it mean to really ground our theology in these realities of the subjugation and suffering of our communities? How do we respond faithfully, in the God of liberation that we profess? How do we ensure that that is not an abstraction, but that it is true? That it is real, and that it is directly connected and reflecting our contexts. I think that's the task that we have to do as theologians, as we make these contributions to society, as we connect with the work of ministry on the ground, as we connect with grassroots movements. There is a great need for liberation theologies, for liberating faith to speak into this void, into this moment where Christianity has been weaponized against the least of these among us, against the gospel itself, against the very Jesus that walked and lived, to stand at the margins. And so I think our theologians need to, ask those questions that the first waves of liberation theologies have asked. Who is God? Where is God? Who are we in relationship to God? But really rooted in our current contemporary moment. Dr. Martin Luther King spoke of those triple evils, generations ago, that he named as militarism, extreme poverty or economic injustice and systemic racism. There's a fourth, obviously, that will be discussed here in this series, which is, the issue of ecological devastation. These evils are still here with us. And as theologians and practitioners, we need to call them out and then connect with the grassroots movements that are responding and trying to make sense of where is God in all of this, right? And how do we sort of collectively respond as the people of God, as the grassroots ecclesia, the ecclesia that is rooted in liberation, rolling up our sleeves to actually reflect this liberating God in the here and now. And so I'll stop there as we engage in this critical conversation and this moment. Thank you so much for the invitation.
Wonderful. Thank you so much to the Reverend Dr. Garcia for those initial reflections. For the sake of time, I'd like to invite Dr. Rivera and the Reverend Dr. Garcia to join in conversation together. If you have questions for each other or remarks for each other, now is the time to engage with those. So thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much, Dr. Garcia, because you contextualized our current moment here in the US, and the realities that we are facing in the US and the implications of those realities for us as people that are religious, who have faith, and more specifically, who have faith in a liberating God. I'm worried that in some ways what's taking place, and I don't know if it's necessarily new, perhaps it has been taking place, and now it's just really coming to the fore, is that we're witnessing these competing visions and narratives of what it means to be human in the United States. Who is a human, right? Who are we including and excluding in our vision, in our narrative of what constitutes a human, right? I'm also concerned that we're witnessing this competition, these competing narratives around visions of what it means to be Christian, right? Who is a Christian? What does a Christian look like, right? I think, recent events have really brought that to the fore, right? Because there are some that we lift up as models of what it means to be Christian. I'm not so sure that they're my models, right? So what does it mean to be Christian? Who is a Christian? Who makes that claim? And I think finally there's, competing visions and narratives around what it means to be the US, right? Who belongs here and who doesn't, right? Who is, to use the problematic term, who's an American? What does an American look like? What does an American sound like? And how do we understand that, right? Who's defining this, right? Who's exercising power in ways that there are these narratives out there that say, well, to be an American is to be white and Christian, right? And conservative. Right? Who's benefiting from that narrative? And who's being oppressed by that? Right? Who's benefiting from the narrative that suggests that to be American means you speak a certain language? And if you don't, go back to where you came from, right? Well, if we're privileging a narrative that comes a certain way, well, yeah, right? There are people that are getting to define that, right? But if we think about narratives coming up another way, right? Then we challenge that and say, we've been here for a minute, So I think that that's a concern I have, that I'm witnessing these competing narratives, right? Who's Christian? Who's a human, right? Who's an American? And these have serious consequences, right, for our communities, Black and brown communities in the U.S. today.
Oh, absolutely. I agree 100%. I think in addition to that, like who is human, who gets to be human, who gets to be safe, right? Who gets to be, who gets to feel safe living their daily life, right? The notion of belonging, literally we have this fear of people that many in our communities have, of walking out the door. This jornalero, this day laborer, right? He took the risk because I assume of economic need. Everybody, most of us need to work in order to feed our families and pay the bills. He knew the risk of going to the to the parking lot of the Home Depot, and yet he did it, as an incredible act of love, to take care of his own and his family, and because of this narrative and the policies that then get legislated, as you mentioned, that was taken away from him and his family today, right? And this is just one case of thousands every day in this moment, and so it's not even so it's like the question of who is human, but even just like basic concepts and practices like love, right? We saw that happen earlier this year with J.D. Vance sort of trying to sort of, theologize about the ordering of love. Like we take care of our immediate first, and, as a way to sanction, anti-immigrant, policy, right? So we have a certain kind of theologizing rooted in exclusion that is happening at the highest levels of our political apparatus, and we see the impact.
That's really interesting. I'm wondering, just raising the question, is it possible then that we think liberation from the experience of love, right? That we think liberation in terms of loving those precisely whom we're not supposed to love, right? And understanding those who we're not supposed to love as the privileged sight of God's presence.
Yeah, I mean, our liberation theologies need to speak to the moment of that, and how do we show up in a way that lifts up the humanity, right? Works against dehumanization in all its forms, and tries to rehumanize. Even, right, if we take the gospel to its greatest extent of loving our enemies, even towards our enemies, right? So that what we strive for is a truly, like, going back to Dr. King, like a true beloved community, right? But where people can flourish and thrive and belong, collectively, even in the midst of a difference, right? Because of difference.
Right. Yeah. Loving in some ways as an act of liberation, but in recognition of the diversity, right, of our humanity, not as a problem to be overcome, but as a gift to be celebrated, right? And so in our difference, in our embodied difference and particularities, whether they are racial, ethnic, social, sexual, cultural, we encounter the divine in our difference. Right?
Yes.
And we love in difference, not indifferently, but love in difference. Right? Now, what scares me is I recently heard someone say that they hate their opponents and they don't want the best for them. And this is a person who is influential and is exercising power and wielding that hatred in some very real and concrete ways. Right? So I think love, right, in a context where we're being told, I hate my opponents, right, is a radical political act.
Absolutely. And I think that's where we can pick up on, our social movement tradition, which have almost always been informed by a liberation-oriented faith. Even before, say, liberation theology was a term, right? We had freedom struggles that were rooted in this revolutionary understanding of love and this praxis that was rooted in nonviolence, right? A nonviolent direct action ethic that exposed injustice and ultimately was working towards, long horizon, right? This is a long horizon, but the long horizon of reconciliation, right? Believing that if there is justice first, right, perhaps we can get to reconciliation, Yeah. And I think that liberation theology can speak to this, right? We have a tradition, right? We have the movements like the United Farm Workers and Dolores Huerta, Cesar Chavez, which learned from the civil rights movement, from the Black freedom struggle, sort of in our Latina context, that really saw Jesus as that figure, as the consummate organizer, the consummate expression of love and of standing, with the most suffering, amongst our communities, but also from a place of empowering to make actual change.
Yeah, thank you. It's powerful.
Thank you both so much for that wonderful conversation. There's actually a point in relation to a point that Reverend Dr. Garcia made about the importance of remembering the imperative to love our enemies. I remember the addition of the late Gustavo Gutierrez to the framework of what was the exact wording? That the liberation begins for the oppressed, it starts for the oppressed, but it must continue with the liberation of the oppressor. So I think about that a lot in that last bit that the two of you were in conversation. Like that's what came to my mind is like, yes, to have that notion of like hating our enemies is contrary to the narrative of liberation. So I was thinking about that as you were both talking. But anyway, enough of my thoughts. We're not here to talk about me. So I wanted to thank you both so sincerely for being here and for the many insights that you brought to this conversation. I would like now to once again invite Dr. Rodriguez to speak so he can provide us with some important announcements and ways to connect with HSP.
Thank you so much, Taina, and thank you, Dr. Rivera, Dr. Garcia. I cannot thank you enough for your presence, for your words, for your wisdom, for your history. So much of this present moment is a question of, as Dr. Rivera said, who is allowed to be human? And that question isn't just about policy, isn't just about economics. It's about theology. It's about those things beyond and the más allá that help us understand what it means to be a little bit more free. And so for us as an educational institution, part of what we do is try to cultivate spaces where we can explore those traditions whereby our people have asked these questions before so that we know we aren't reinventing the wheel, but are rather leaning onto the shoulders of those who came before. So thank you both for your incredible insights, to Taina for the moderation, to the HSP staff that's in the background making this possible. Thank you. So I want to just offer as we close 5 ways that you can stay connected to the HSP if you enjoyed what you saw here, if you gained something, if you learned something. The first is that we're going to have the second part of this series on November 5th with Dr. Barbara Andrea Sostaita, who will be speaking on immigration theology and liberation theology. That will be on November 5th. Follow our Eventbrite, where we'll be posting about this. You'll see it on social media as well. The second way to stay connected is to follow us on social media. Our @ is at Hispanic Scholars Program on all platforms. The third is to join our mailing list. If you have not done so, you can do so via our website, HispanicScholarsProgram.org. The fourth, I'm very excited about. If you are a current student, a current master's level student, you can apply for our J-term. Applications went live today. The J term this year will be start on January 6th. Applications are live today until November 1st, and the course being taught is entitled Citizenship Otherwise: Belonging and the Borders of the Ethical with Dr. Alexandra Rosado Roman. So please visit our website, HispanicScholarsProgram.org/program/JTerm to check out that course. And then finally, if you were moved by what happened today, if you want to see this type of production happen more and more and more, especially in this moment of incredible social unrest, I invite you to donate to the Hispanic Scholars Program. You can do so on our website, HispanicScholarsProgram.org/donate. Just $15 a month helps pay for the infrastructure that makes this work possible, that helps us offer public scholarship like the one you experienced today every single month of the academic year. So please consider a donation. Just $15 a month helps us do this consistently, especially in this moment where we need more educational tools, models, history, sociologies, frameworks for understanding and responding to the socio-political present. Thank you once more, Dr. Bobby Rivera, and to Dr. Garcia. I'm grateful for your presence, and I will give it back to Taina for a closing word.
Thank you, Dr. Rodriguez. I want to again say a resounding muchísimas gracias to our speaker and our respondent for their expertise, their time, and their valuable contributions to this evening, to this programming. I'd also like to take a moment to extend sincere, profound gratitude to the HSP for their funding assistance in ensuring the success of this event and the series as a whole. And finally, on behalf of Han, I'd like to thank you, our attendees, for spending your Wednesday night with us and learning about these important topics and connections. If you enjoyed this evening and want to see more programming like this, just like Dr. Rodriguez said, please make a donation to the Hispanic Scholars Program. Everything is working towards supporting our community, both present and future, in doing theology Latinamente. So again, thank you so much. Apologies for not being able to get to your questions for the Q&A. But thank you so much for being with us tonight and participating in these timely conversations. Have a blessed evening and be well, everyone.